They turned him away with nothing but snow at his back and a sick boy in his arms. And in a town like that, doors didn't open twice. But Clara Whitfield still reached for the latch, her fingers cold, her cupboard nearly empty, her roof already promised to a man who didn't believe mercy paid debts. And yet she stepped aside and said, "Just for the night," like it didn't cost her everything. The wind slipping in behind them, carrying the smell of leather, wet horse, and something older than the road itself. The man said little, hat low, voice steady, thanking her once and no more, while the boy, no older than 10, burned with fever beneath a coat too thin for a Colorado winter. And Clara moved quick, like she'd done this before, like she'd learned early that waiting meant losing. She pulled the last blanket from her own bed, laid it over the child, set water to warm over a fire that barely held, the wood cracking soft in the silence. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the world outside had paused, like the town that whispered about her debts and her failures had forgotten she existed. But it never really did, not in places like this, where a girl alone was always being watched, always being measured for what she couldn't pay. The man stood near the doorway at first, boots still dusted with miles, eyes scanning the room like he was memorizing it, every nail in the wall, every crack in the boards. And there was something about the way he stood that didn't match. The dust on his coat, something quiet and deliberate, like he wasn't used to asking for anything, Clara noticed. But she said nothing, just dipped a cloth into warm water and pressed it gently to the boy's forehead, the heat rising off him like summer in the desert. "He'll be all right," she whispered, though she didn't know if that was true. The man watched her then, really watched, as if kindness was a language he hadn't heard in a long time. "You don't have much," he said finally, voice low, not accusing, just certain. Clara gave a small shrug, the kind that comes from years of having nothing to explain. "Enough for tonight," she answered. And that was all. No story, no complaint, just a fact that hung in the air between them. The fire shifted, shadows moving slow across the walls, and outside, the wind dragged across the plains, rattling the loose boards like something trying to get in. Hours passed that way, quiet, steady, the boy's breathing easing just enough to matter, Clara sitting beside him, refusing sleep like it was a luxury she couldn't afford. And the man, Ethan Hale, though she did not yet know his name, remained still, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, as if grounding himself in a place he didn't belong. At some point he reached into his coat and set something small on the table beside her, a piece of silver catching the firelight, worn smooth at the edges, a badge or a token. Clara barely glanced at it, assuming it meant little. People left behind things all the time when they had nothing else to give, and she had never been one to ask what a thing was worth, only whether it mattered. "For the trouble," he said, but she shook her head without looking up. "Keep it," she murmured, wringing out the cloth again. "You might need it more than I do." And that made him pause, not because of the words, but because of how easily she said them. Like giving something away didn't leave her with less. The fire burned lower, the night stretched long, and somewhere beyond the hills, something shifted, unseen, unheard by Clara as she finally leaned back against the wall, eyes heavy but still open, watching the boy breathe, watching the man who hadn't moved, watching a quiet she had learned not to trust, because mornings in this town never came without a price. And when the first light finally touched the edge of the window, pale and cold, it carried with it a distant sound, faint at first, like thunder too far away to matter, but steady, growing, hoofbeats rolling across frozen ground. And though Clara did not yet rise, did not yet understand, something deep in the stillness of that room began to change, like the world outside had finally remembered her door. The sound did not stop, it only grew closer, steady and measured, like something that did not rush, because it did not need to. Clara opened her eyes fully now, her body stiff from the cold wall behind her. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a weak orange glow across the floorboards, and for a second she thought she had imagined it. The night had been long and hunger had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But then it came again, clearer this time, hoofbeats, not one horse, not two, but many moving together across frozen ground. She pushed herself up slowly, careful not to wake the boy, whose breathing had softened into something almost peaceful. Ethan was already standing by the door, hat in hand, Listening without turning his head, as if he had been awake long before the sound reached her. You hear that she whispered, though the answer was already in the stillness between them. He gave a slight nod, nothing more, and that was when Clara felt it. Not fear, not yet, but something deeper, something that told her this morning would not pass like the others. She moved to the window, brushing aside the thin curtain, the glass clouded with frost, and outside the pale light of dawn stretched across the empty road that led into town. For a moment, there was nothing, just the same quiet she had known her whole life. And then shapes appeared in the distance, small at first, dark against the white horizon. Riders one after another emerging from the low hills, their movements slow, deliberate, not the frantic kind of men chasing trouble, but the kind that carried it with them. Clara counted, without meaning to, 1, 2, 5, 10. Her breath caught as more followed behind until the line seemed to stretch longer than the road itself. They were not dressed like townsfolk, not merchants, not drifters. Their coats were heavy, their posture straight, their horses strong and well kept. Even from this distance, she could see the difference. These were not men who asked for shelter. These were men who expected doors to open. She stepped back from the window, her hand tightening around the edge of the table, the silver object still resting there where Ethan had left it, catching the faint light. She had ignored it before, but now it seemed to hold a weight. She could not explain. "What is this?" she asked quietly, picking it up, the metal cold against her skin. Ethan turned, then his eyes falling to the object in her hand. For the first time since he arrived, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not concern, something quieter, recognition. "You should not have refused that," he said, his voice low. Clara frowned slightly. "I do not take things I do not understand," she answered, simple as that. He studied her for a moment longer, as if measuring something unseen, before stepping closer, not to take it from her, but to look at it where it rested in her palm. "It is not payment," he said. After a pause, "It is a name." Clara glanced down again, the worn edges, the engraving faint, but still there, a mark she had never seen before, and yet something about it felt official, like it belonged somewhere far beyond her small broken home. Outside, the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped completely. The silence that followed, heavier than the sound itself. Clara felt it settle into the walls, into her chest, into the space between every breath. "They are here," she whispered, though she did not know who they were. Ethan reached for the door, but did not open it, yet instead he looked back at the boy, still sleeping, his fever broken, his face calm for the first time since they arrived. And then he looked at Clara, really looked at her the same way he had the night before, only now there was something else beneath it, something like decision. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "do not speak unless you need to." Clara felt her heart begin to pound, not from fear, but from the unknown pressing in around her. She nodded once, slow and steady. "Because out here you learned early that asking questions did not always bring answers. Sometimes it only made things worse." Ethan opened the door then, and the cold morning air rushed in sharp and clean, carrying with it the scent of leather and dust, and something heavier, something that spoke of distance and power. Clara stepped just behind him, her hand still holding the silver token, as she looked past his shoulder and saw them clearly for the first time, rows of riders filling the space in front of her home, stretching out into the road. Their horses still, their eyes fixed forward. No one spoke, no one moved. It was not chaos, it was order, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And at the front of them, a man dismounted slowly, his boots touching the ground with care, not haste, his coat dark, his posture straight. And though Clara had never seen him before, she knew instantly this was not a man who came to ask for anything. He took a step forward, his gaze lifting from the ground to the doorway. And for a moment, just a moment, his eyes met Ethan's, and something passed between them, silent and absolute. Clara felt it like a shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. And then the man lowered his head, not much, just enough to be seen, and the riders behind him followed one after another until the entire line stood in still, quiet acknowledgement. Clara's breath caught in her throat, because she had never seen anything like it, not in this town, not anywhere. And beside her, Ethan Hale stepped forward into the morning light, as if he had been expected all along. No one spoke, not at first, not even the wind seemed willing to cross the space between them. Clara stood just behind the doorway, her fingers tightening slightly around the silver token as if it might steady her, though she did not know why. The man in front straightened slowly after that brief nod, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. And there was something in that silence that did not feel like fear, it felt like recognition, the kind that carried weight across miles and years. "We have been looking for you," the man said finally, his voice calm, but carrying easily through the still air, and Clara felt the words more than she heard them, like They belonged to something larger than this moment. Ethan did not answer right away. He stepped forward another pace, boots pressing into the frost, as if claiming the ground. Without saying, "So you found me," he said, simply, not surprised, not relieved, just stating a fact. The man gave a slight nod. "We followed the storm trail, and the last report came from the ridge near Hollow Creek. After that, nothing." Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the line of riders behind him. "Then back again. You brought too many." The man allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. Not too many for what was at stake. Clara felt her breath catch again, because whatever this was, it was not about one man, or even a handful of them. It stretched further than she could see, further than this town that had always felt like the center of everything she knew. Behind her, the boy stirred softly, a small movement beneath the blanket, and Clara turned instinctively, stepping back inside for a moment to check on him. His fever had broken completely. Now his skin no longer burning, his breathing steady and calm. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, and for a second the world narrowed again to something simple, something she understood, a child who needed care, but even that felt different now, like it belonged to a story she had not been told yet. When she stepped back to the doorway, the air outside had changed, not in sound, not in movement, but in meaning. The riders had not shifted, they had not spoken, but their attention had sharpened, as if something invisible had drawn a line between what had been and what was coming. The man at the front reached into his coat slowly, carefully, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, but sealed with a mark Clara could not make out from where she stood. He held it out, not to Clara, not to anyone else, but directly to Ethan. "This came ahead of us," he said, "delivered through 3 towns, each one confirming the same thing." Ethan took the paper, without hesitation, breaking the seal. With a single motion, his eyes moving across the page, quickly, not lingering, not reacting in any way Clara could read. But when he finished, he folded it once more, just as neatly as before, and slipped it into his coat again. "They moved faster than expected," he said, quiet enough that it might have been meant only for himself. The man's expression hardened slightly. "We thought the same. That is why we rode through the night." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, because now there was something else beneath the calm, something that suggested whatever had brought these men here was not finished, not resolved. Ethan glanced back over his shoulder, then meeting Clara's eyes for just a second, and in that look there was something new, not distance, not observation, something closer to acknowledgement, as if he now understood exactly what she had given the night before. Without ever asking her name, "You should step inside," he said to her, his voice steady, but carrying a quiet weight. Clara did not move, not right away. She had spent too many years being told to step aside, to stay quiet, to let others decide what happened to her home, her life, her place in this town. And yet now, standing there with dozens of riders in front of her door, and a man beside her who clearly belonged to something far beyond it, she felt something shift inside her, not defiance, not exactly, but a kind of stillness that refused to be pushed back. "This is my home," she said softly, not loud, not challenging, just true. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, and then something almost like approval flickered across his face before he turned back toward the man in front of him. "It will remain that way," he said, and though the words were simple, Clara felt them settle into the ground beneath her feet, like a promise that did not need to be explained. The man nodded once, understanding passing between them. Without further question, then from somewhere beyond the line of riders a new sound rose, not hoofbeats, not the quiet stillness that had held until now, but voices, distant at first, carried on the cold air from the direction of town. Clara turned her head slightly, listening, the sound growing clearer, men calling out orders, doors opening, hurried footsteps on frozen ground. The town had woken up, and it had seen what stood outside her door, and whatever came next would not belong only to her anymore. The voices from town came faster now, not ordered, not calm, but restless, like something had been stirred that could not be put back down. Clara could see them in the distance, men gathering near the main road, coats thrown on in haste, boots half-laced, some still carrying tools from yesterday, as if they had run out without thinking, because what waited at the edge of her land was not something this town had ever seen before. And at the front of that growing crowd, one figure moved with purpose, cutting through the others without slowing. Victor Crowley did not rush, he never did. Even now his steps were measured, his coat pulled tight against the cold, his eyes fixed ahead as if he already knew what he would find. Clara felt her stomach tighten at the sight of him, because she knew why he would be coming, not for the riders, not for the man beside her, but for the house, the land, the debt that had followed her like a shadow for years. Ethan did not turn toward the approaching town. He did not need to. The shift in the air said enough. The riders remained still, their formation unbroken, their presence filling the space in a way that made the ground feel smaller. Victor reached the front of the townspeople and stopped just far enough away to take it all in. His gaze moved across the line of horses, the men seated upon them, the quiet that held them together, and for the first time Clara saw something she had never seen on his face before. Not fear, not quite, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is no longer the one setting the terms. "What is this?" he asked finally, his voice sharp enough to cut through the distance, but lacking the certainty it once carried. No one answered him, not the riders, not Ethan, not even the wind. It seemed to wait. Victor's eyes narrowed as they settled on Clara standing in the doorway of the house he had already claimed on paper. "You should not be here," he said to her, his tone returning to something more familiar, more controlled. "This matter has already been settled." Clara felt the words press against her, but they did not move her the way they used to. She tightened her grip on the silver token still resting in her hand, its weight steady grounding. She did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. "This is still my home," she replied, her voice quiet but clear enough to reach him. Victor exhaled slowly, as if reminding himself of patience before taking a step forward, just one, but enough to signal that he believed the ground still belonged to him. "You had your time," he said, "and now it has passed. You owe what you owe, and I have come to collect." Ethan moved, then not quickly, not forcefully, just one step forward, placing himself between Clara and the man without raising his voice or his hand, and somehow that single movement carried more authority than anything Victor had said. The riders behind him shifted slightly, not breaking formation, but adjusting, as if responding to a signal that had not been spoken. Victor's attention snapped to Ethan, his expression tightening as he studied him properly for the first time, taking in the dust-worn coat, the stillness, the way he stood without asking permission, and something in that recognition began to form, though it had not yet found its name. "You are not from this town," Victor said slowly. Ethan did not deny it. No. Victor's eyes flicked briefly to the riders again, then back to the man in front of him, as if trying to place a memory he could not quite reach. "This land is under my authority," he continued more carefully. "Now every property, every agreement, every debt passes through me." Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the words, not dismissing them, not accepting them, simply weighing them in the quiet space between them. And then he spoke, not louder, not sharper, just clearer than before. "Authority is a word people use when they believe no one will question it." The line of townspeople behind Victor shifted uneasily, the murmurs starting low carried from one person to another, because something in that sentence did not fit the world they thought they understood. Victor's jaw tightened, his patience thinning as the ground beneath his certainty continued to shift. "You have no standing here," he said more firmly now. "Whatever business you think you have, it does not concern you." Ethan reached into his coat, then slow, deliberate, the same way he had taken the paper earlier, and Clara felt her breath catch, because she knew before he even moved what he would pull out the silver token, its twin, the one she still held in her hand. He turned it once between his fingers, letting the light catch the worn engraving, before holding it out, not toward Clara, not toward the riders, but toward Victor. Victor looked at it, and in that moment the air changed completely, not with sound, not with movement, but with understanding. His expression stilled, his eyes narrowing, not in confusion, but in recognition. Something old, something buried, rising to the surface, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The voices behind him faded, the shifting stopped, even the cold seemed to hold its breath, and for the first time since he had stepped onto this land, Victor Crowley did not speak. Victor Crowley did not reach for the token. He did not step back either. He simply stood there, staring at the worn silver in Ethan's hand, as if it had spoken a language only he could understand, and for a long second no one else moved, not the riders, not the townspeople, not even Clara, who felt the weight of that silence settle deeper than anything that had come before. "You have no right to carry that," Victor said finally. But the certainty was gone from his voice, replaced by something thinner, something that sounded like a man trying to hold on to ground already slipping beneath him. Ethan lowered the token slightly, but did not put it away. "Rights are not something you carry," he said quietly. "They are something you are given, and something you can lose." Victor's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face shifting as he looked from the token to Ethan's eyes, and then back again, as if searching for a flaw, a mistake, anything that would return the world to the shape he understood. "You expect me to believe that you are the one," he said, the words coming slower, now measured, careful, as if each one needed to be placed correctly. "I do not expect anything," Ethan replied, And that was when it happened, not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. The man who had first dismounted earlier stepped forward just one pace, enough to stand clearly at Ethan's side, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the space, without effort. This land, all of it, from the northern ridge to the dry river valley, falls under the Hale Trust, and has for the past 23 years. Clara felt the words settle into her like cold water, clear and undeniable. The Hale Trust. She had heard the name before. Everyone had. It was spoken in low voices in the general store, in cautious tones at the edge of conversations about land and debt, about who truly owned what, in a place where ownership often changed hands. Without warning, Victor's expression shifted again, not disbelief, not denial, but recognition, sharpened into something harder, something that could not be easily undone. You have been absent, he said to Ethan, as if grasping for a different angle, as if absence itself might erase what stood in front of him. Absence does not change ownership, Ethan answered, and then, after a pause, but it does reveal character. The words hung there, simple but heavy, and Clara saw the way the townspeople behind Victor reacted, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small ways. A glance exchanged, a step shifted, a breath held too long, because they were beginning to understand something that had never been explained to them directly. The rules they had lived by were not the only ones that existed. Victor let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking once more toward the house, toward Clara standing in the doorway, still holding the second token in her hand, as if she had become part of something larger, without ever choosing to. You are interfering in a private agreement, he said. But even as he spoke, the words lacked force. They sounded like something repeated rather than believed. Ethan followed his gaze to Clara, and for a moment the tension in his posture eased just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to see. She gave you shelter, he said, returning his attention to Victor when no one else would. Victor's expression hardened again, grasping for control. That has nothing to do with the law, it has everything to do with it, Ethan replied, not raising his voice, not stepping closer, just standing there, as if the ground itself supported what he said. The man beside him reached into his coat, then, and withdrew a folded document thicker than the one before. Its edges reinforced, its seal intact. He stepped forward, offering it not to Ethan this time, but directly to Victor. Victor hesitated only for a fraction of a second before taking it, his fingers tightening slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. Clara watched his eyes move across the lines, watched the change happen, not all at once, but in stages, the certainty draining, first replaced by calculation, then by something quieter, something closer to understanding. The townspeople leaned, and slightly, not enough to seem obvious, but enough to show that whatever was written there mattered more than anything spoken. So far, Victor read to the end, then read part of it again, as if hoping the words might change, and when he finally lowered the paper, his shoulders had shifted, not fallen, not weakened, but adjusted, like a man who had just discovered the ground he stood on belonged to someone else. This property, he began, then stopped, his voice catching not from fear, but from the effort of recalculating everything in front of him. Ethan did not help him, did not rush him, did not explain. He simply waited, and in that waiting there was no urgency, no need to prove anything, because the truth did not require it. Clara felt her grip on the token loosen, slightly, not from doubt, but from the strange realization that for the first time since she could remember, the outcome of this moment did not depend on how loudly someone spoke or how strongly they demanded it, depended on something quieter, something already decided long before this morning had begun. And as Victor finally lifted his eyes again to meet Ethan's gaze, there was no anger left in them, only the sharp, clear understanding that whatever came next would not be his to choose. The paper did not fall from Victor's hand, but it might as well have. The way his fingers loosened around it, as if the weight of it had changed. Clara could see it now clearly, the shift that no word could hide. The man who had walked here certain of the outcome was no longer standing on the same ground he had arrived with this agreement. He began again, slower this time, careful with each word, as if the space around him had become fragile. This agreement was signed under lawful terms. Ethan did not move, not a step, not a breath out of place. Lawful does not always mean rightful, he said, and the sentence did not strike like a challenge. It settled like truth, something that did not need to be defended. Victor's eyes flicked once more to the document, then to the writers behind Ethan, and for the first time, he seemed to understand the full shape of what stood in front of him, not just one man, not just a name, but a system, a structure, something that had been watching long before this morning. Clara felt her chest tighten, but not with fear, with something unfamiliar, something that felt like the edge of relief, though she did not yet trust it. You allowed this town to operate under your absence, Victor said. His voice quieter now, not weaker, but measured differently, as if he was speaking to someone whose answer mattered. Ethan gave a slight nod. I allowed it to reveal itself. Victor exhaled through his nose, the sound sharp in the cold air. Then you know how things work here, he said. Debts are honored, or they are taken. Ethan looked past him, then toward the gathered townspeople, not with accusation, not with anger, just observation, and Clara saw it too now, the way they stood, not together, not truly, some closer to Victor, some further back, some uncertain, as if the ground beneath them had begun to shift in ways they did not understand. Debts are honored, he said finally, but not all debts are written on paper. The words moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass, quiet but impossible to ignore. Clara felt her fingers tighten again around the token, not from fear, but because she understood something now, something she had never been given the chance to see before. Victor followed Ethan's gaze, and for a moment his expression faltered, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well. This is not about sentiment, he said quickly, as if trying to recover ground. This is about order, about keeping things running. Ethan returned his gaze, steady and unchanged. Order without fairness is not order, it is convenience, and convenience has a cost. Victor did not answer right away, and in that pause Clara saw the truth of it, not in his words, but in his silence, because there was no easy way to argue with something that had already been proven by the way people lived, by the way they had treated her, by the way they had closed their doors. The night before, the man beside Ethan stepped forward again, not intruding, not interrupting, but present, as he spoke clearly for all to hear. The Hale Trust has reviewed the holdings of this town, all claims, all liens, all agreements, and found discrepancies. Clara did not know the word fully, but she felt its meaning like a shift in the air. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of discrepancies, he asked, though the answer was already forming in the tension around him. The kind that favors one man over many. The man replied, the kind that assumes no one will look closely enough to question it. The murmurs grew louder, now not loud enough to break the moment, but enough to show that the balance had begun to tilt. Clara saw faces she recognized, neighbors who had once turned away from her, now watching Victor, not with loyalty, but with something else, something closer to doubt. Ethan stepped forward, then just one pace, bringing himself level with Victor, not above him, not below him. Simply present the property, she said, quietly, nodding once toward Clara, is not yours to take. Victor's hand tightened around the paper again, instinctively, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. The agreement, he began, but the words did not carry the same weight anymore. Ethan did not let him finish. It is void, he said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a finality that left no room for argument. Clara felt the words settle into her like warmth after a long cold night. Void, not delayed, not reconsidered, gone. Victor's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a man understands the rules have changed and not in his favor. He looked once more at Clara, standing in the doorway, the girl he had dismissed, the house he had already counted as his, and for a brief moment something passed through his expression, not regret, not apology, but awareness. He folded the paper slowly, deliberately, then lowered it to his side. This is not finished, he said, but even he seemed to know it was. Ethan did not respond, because there was nothing left to say. The truth had already taken its place, and in the quiet that followed, Clara Whitfield stood in her doorway, still holding a piece of silver she had almost refused the night before, and realized that everything she thought she had lost had never truly belonged to the man who tried to take it. No one moved to leave, not immediately, not even Victor, though the paper in his hand no longer carried the weight it once had. The riders remained still, their presence unchanged, but something had shifted in the space between every man standing there, something quiet and irreversible. Clara felt it like the air after a storm, not louder, not brighter, just clearer. Victor looked once more at Ethan, then at the house, then at the people behind him, and for the first time he seemed smaller, not in stature, not in voice, but in certainty, the kind that cannot be forced back once it has been broken. You have made your point, he said finally, his tone controlled, but stripped of the edge it once held. Ethan did not respond, because the moment did not belong to words anymore, it belonged to what had already been seen. Victor turned, then slowly, not rushed, not defeated, but deliberate, as if choosing each step with care. The townspeople parted for him without being told, some stepping back quickly, others slower, unsure where they now stood in a world that no longer followed the rules they had trusted. He walked past them without looking back, and one by one the tension that had held the morning in place began to loosen, not vanish, not yet, but eased just enough to breathe. Clara watched him go, her hand still wrapped around the silver token, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just unfolded. The man who had come to take everything had left with nothing, and no one had raised a hand, no one had shouted, no one had forced him. He had simply understood, and that understanding had been enough. Beside her, Ethan exhaled slowly, the first sign that the moment had required something of him. The riders behind him shifted, then not breaking formation, but relaxing just enough to show that whatever they had come prepared for was no longer needed. The man who had spoken earlier stepped forward once more, his gaze moving from Ethan to Clara, and there was something different in his expression, now not assessment, not caution, but respect, the kind that is given not because it must be, but because it is earned. He reached into his coat again and withdrew another document, thinner this time, less formal, but no less deliberate. He held it out toward Clara, not pressing it, not forcing it, simply offering it, as if the choice remained hers. She hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but out of habit, because nothing in her life had ever been given without a cost, and yet everything about this moment felt different. The silence, the stillness, the way no one demanded anything from her. She stepped forward, slowly crossing the threshold of her own doorway, as if doing so meant stepping into something she had never been allowed to claim before, and she took the paper, her fingers brushing against the edge of it, careful, steady. As she unfolded it, the words were simple. She could read enough to understand what mattered: the property, the land, the structure, the boundaries, everything that had been written against her name now carried it again, not as debt, not as burden, but as ownership. Clara felt her breath catch, not from disbelief, but from the quiet realization that nothing about this moment had been rushed, nothing had been taken by force, it had been returned. Ethan watched her as she read, not speaking, not guiding, simply present. And when she finally looked up at him, there was no need for explanation. "You gave shelter," he said softly, as if repeating something that had already been decided. Clara shook her head slightly, not in denial, but in understanding. "I did what anyone should do," she replied, and for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched his expression, not wide, not obvious, but real. "Not everyone does," he said, and the truth of that settled deeper than anything else. That morning the riders began to turn, then not all at once, but in a slow, measured motion, their horses shifting under them as they prepared to leave, without ceremony, without announcement, because their presence had never been about spectacle, it had been about certainty. The man beside Ethan gave a final nod, then stepped back, returning to his place among them, and one by one they moved away, the sound of hooves returning not as thunder, but as distance fading into the horizon. Clara stood there watching until they were gone, until the road looked like it always had, empty, quiet, unchanged, except it was not unchanged, not anymore. Behind her the boy stirred again, his voice soft, as he called out, and Ethan turned immediately, stepping back inside. Without hesitation, the moment outside already finished, as if it had never belonged to him at all. Clara remained in the doorway for a second longer, the paper still in her hand, the silver token still warm from her grip, and the town behind her silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they no longer knew how to say it. And in that silence something new began, not loud, not certain, but real, a kind of respect that did not come from fear or power, but from a door opened on a cold night when no one else would open. There's the sound of the riders faded into the distance until it became nothing more than a memory carried by the wind. And for a long moment no one in the town moved, as if they were all waiting for something else to happen, something louder, something clearer, something that would explain what they had just witnessed. But nothing came. No command, no announcement, no final word. Just silence. Clara lowered her eyes to the paper in her hands again, the ink steady, the lines simple, the meaning undeniable. This land was hers, not by favor, not by chance, but by right, a right that had existed long before this morning and had simply been returned. She let out a slow breath, one she had been holding for longer than she realized, and when she lifted her head the town was still there, watching, not with the same eyes as before, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something uncertain. A few of them shifted their weight, others looked down at the ground, as if unsure where to place their gaze, because the story they had told themselves about Clara Whitfield no longer fit the truth. Standing in front of them, a man, near the edge of the crowd, took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, as if remembering something that held him back. No one spoke, no one dared to fill the silence with the wrong words, because out here words had a way of lasting longer than they Should Clara turned slowly and stepped back inside the door, closing behind her with a soft wooden sound that felt louder than anything that had happened outside. The room was warmer now, not because the fire had grown, but because the cold that had followed her for years had loosened its hold just enough to let something else in. Ethan stood near the bed, where Noah now sat upright, his face pale, but clear, his eyes no longer clouded with fever. The boy looked toward Clara, then toward his father, as if trying to understand what had changed. He heard the horses, he said quietly. They came for us. Ethan knelt beside him, not rushed, not concerned, just present. They came because it was time, he answered, and the boy seemed to accept that in a way only a child could, without needing more, without asking for the weight behind the words. Clara folded the paper carefully, her fingers moving slower than usual, not from hesitation, but from respect, as if the act itself mattered. She placed it on the table beside the silver token, the two objects now side by side, no longer separate, no longer uncertain. Ethan rose, then turning toward her, his expression the same as it had been through the night, steady, contained, but there was something else there now, something she could not name at first, something that felt like recognition. You did not ask who I was, he said, and it was not a question. Clara gave a small shake of her head. I saw what I needed to see, she replied, and that answer lingered between them longer than anything else had, because it held something simple, something that did not depend on names or titles or the weight of what a man owned. Ethan nodded once, slow, as if confirming something to himself. Then you gave without knowing what it would return. Clara glanced at the door, then back at him, her voice quiet but certain. I did not give for it to return, and in that moment the room seemed to still in a different way, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded, as if something true had finally been spoken without needing to be proven. Noah swung his legs gently over the side of the bed, his small boots not quite touching the floor. He looked between them both, then down at the silver token on the table. What is that, he asked. Clara followed his gaze, then reached for it, lifting it into her hand once more. It is a name, she said softly, repeating the words she had been given, but now they carried a different meaning. Now they felt understood. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, then stepped toward the door, pausing only briefly before opening it. The light outside had shifted. The town no longer gathered in a tight, uncertain line, but spread out again, though not the same as before. People moved slower, spoke quieter, as if something inside them had been adjusted without being told. Clara stepped to the doorway beside him, the paper still inside the house, the token now resting in her palm, the same place it had been when everything began. And as she looked out across the land that had almost been taken from her, she realized something that settled deeper than relief, deeper than gratitude. Nothing had been given to her that was not already hers, and the only reason it had been returned was because on a cold night, when no one else would open their door, she had not asked who deserved it. She had simply opened it. By midday, the town had begun to move again, but not the way it had before, not with the same careless rhythm or easy certainty. Every step seemed measured, every glance held a second longer than it should. Clara noticed it in the way people passed her house, some slowing, without meaning to, others pretending not to look at all, as if ignoring her might return things to what they had been. But nothing returned once it had been seen. The door remained open now, the cold air drifting in and out, carrying the scent of dust and distant horses, though the riders themselves were long gone. Inside the small room, the fire had been rebuilt, not strong, not bright, but steady enough to hold. Noah sat at the table, now a cup of warm broth in his hands, both palms wrapped around it, as if memorizing the feeling of heat. His color had returned slightly, though he still moved with the quiet caution of someone who had been close to losing strength. Ethan stood near the window, not watching the town, not studying the road, simply standing in a way that suggested he was already thinking beyond it. Clara moved about the room, slowly setting things in order, though nothing had truly been out of place to begin with. She needed movement, something to carry the weight of what had settled in her chest. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just new. The paper remained where she had placed it on the table beside the token. She glanced at it once, then again, each time expecting it to change, as if the ink might fade or the words might rearrange themselves into something less certain, but they did not. It stayed the same, quiet and final. You are not staying, she said after a while, not looking at him. As she spoke, because she already knew the answer, Ethan turned slightly, his gaze settling on her with that same calm presence that never pushed, never explained. No, we will leave before the light goes, he replied, and the words did not surprise her, but they did settle differently than she expected. Not disappointment, not relief, something in between, something that felt like understanding reached too early. Noah looked up at that, his small hands tightening Around the cup, just a little. Are we going far? He asked. Ethan gave a slight nod. Far enough. And that was all the boy needed. He did not ask where, he did not ask why, he simply accepted it the way children sometimes do when they trust the direction more than the details. Clara paused in her movement, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. You could stay, she said, then stopped herself, not because the offer was wrong, but because she realized what it meant. It was not the same offer as the night before. It carried weight, now it carried knowledge, and that changed things. Ethan seemed to understand that too, because he shook his head once, not dismissing the offer, not rejecting it, just placing it where it belonged. What you gave last night was not given to who I am, he said. It was given to who you saw. Clara let that settle, because it was true in a way she could not argue. She had opened the door to a man and his son, not to a name, not to a title, not to whatever stood behind him now. The difference stood quietly between them, not as distance, but as clarity. Outside, a figure approached, slowly stopping just short of the doorway. Clara recognized him after a moment. A man from the town, not one who had spoken much before, not one who had turned her away, either just someone who had existed on the edges. He removed his hat as he stood there, uncertain if he should step closer. Miss Whitfield, he said, his voice low, not weak, just careful. Clara turned toward him, her posture straight, not guarded, just steady. Yes. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke as if the words had been difficult to bring forward. I wanted to say something about the way things have been. Clara watched him without interrupting, because she understood something now. Not every apology needed to be spoken fully. Sometimes the effort itself carried enough weight. He shifted, slightly uncomfortable under his own thoughts. We should have done better, he said finally. And there was no defense in it, no excuse, just the truth laid out plain. Clara nodded once, not in acceptance, not in forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The man replaced his hat slowly, then stepped back, not waiting for more, not expecting anything else. And as he turned to leave, she realized something small but important. The town was changing, not because it had been told to, not because it had been forced, but because it had been shown something it could not ignore. Ethan watched the exchange from where he stood, saying nothing, but seeing everything the way he always had. Clara looked back at him, then at Noah, then at the door still open to a town that no longer felt quite the same, and for the first time she understood that what had happened that morning had not ended when the riders left. It had only begun to unfold in quieter ways, in the way people spoke, in the way they stood, in the choices they would make when the next door was closed and someone needed it open. The sun had climbed higher now, but the light did not feel the same. It stretched across the land, slower, softer, as if even it had taken notice of what had shifted. Clara stood just outside the doorway, the wooden step beneath her boots worn smooth from years of standing in the same place, watching the same road that had never brought anything worth waiting for until yesterday, until a storm and two strangers had changed the weight of everything she had ever known. Inside the small house, Noah finished the last of the broth, setting the cup down carefully, as if he had been taught to respect even the smallest things. Ethan moved quietly, gathering what little they had brought with them, his motions efficient, not rushed, the kind of movement that came from a life spent leaving places rather than staying. Clara watched him for a moment, then looked out again, toward the town. A few people still lingered at a distance, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to pretend they were not watching. She could feel it, their attention, different now, not sharp, not cold, just uncertain, like they were learning how to look at her all over again. A woman from the far side of the road paused near the fence line, a basket in her hands. She hesitated, then set it down gently on the post, without speaking, without calling out, just leaving it there. Before turning back the way she came, Clara noticed the contents when she stepped closer. Bread wrapped in cloth, still warm, and a small jar of preserves. Nothing grand, nothing excessive, just enough. And for the first time she understood that change did not always arrive with words. Sometimes it came in quiet offerings left where they could be found. She picked up the basket, holding it for a moment before bringing it inside, placing it on the table beside the paper and the silver token, the three things resting together, now each carrying a different kind of weight. Ethan glanced at them briefly as he finished tying a strap on his saddle through the open doorway, then looked back at Clara. You will not need to worry about them taking anything from you again, he said, and it was not reassurance, it was certainty. Clara nodded once, but her gaze remained on the basket, not because of what it held, but because of what it meant. They were not taking. Before she said slowly, they just believed they could. Ethan stepped closer, then stopping just inside the doorway, his eyes following hers. Belief can shape a place, he said, but it does not make it right. Clara let out a small breath. Almost a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, just recognition. I believed it too, she admitted. For a long time. He studied her for a moment, then spoke softer than before. That is how it works, not through force, not most of the time, but through what people accept as normal. The words settled in the room alongside the others, the paper, the token, the basket, each one a piece of something larger that had taken shape. Without her seeing it, Noah stood, then moving carefully to the doorway, his strength not fully returned, but enough to carry him forward. He looked out across the land, then back at Clara. Thank you, he said simply, and the way he said it made it clear he understood more than a child should about what had been given. Clara smiled faintly, not wide, not proud, just warm. You are welcome, she replied, and that was all it needed to be. Ethan placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, then stepped outside, leading him toward the horses, the animals waiting patiently, as if they had always known when it was time to go. Clara followed to the edge of the steps, stopping there, as she had so many times before, but this moment was not the same. The road no longer looked empty, it looked open. Ethan secured the last strap, then turned back toward her, his expression unchanged, steady, calm. But there was something in his eyes now, something that had not been there the night before, not distance, not caution, something closer to respect. You will do well here, he said, and again it was not encouragement, it was observation. Clara met his gaze, holding it for a second longer than she might have before. I already was, she answered quietly. I just did not know it. He gave a small nod as if that was the answer he had expected, then mounted his horse with a smooth, practiced motion. Noah climbed up behind him, his arms wrapping lightly around his father's waist. The boy looked back, once more, his eyes meeting Clara's, and in that brief glance, there was something unspoken, something that would not fade with distance. Ethan turned the horse slightly, the animal shifting under him, ready. The wind moved across the open land, lifting dust just enough to catch the light, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, not paused, not delayed, just complete. Clara stood there as they began to ride away, not fast, not slow, just steady, the same way they had arrived the day before, only now the meaning had changed. The road stretched ahead of them, wide and open, and behind her the door remained open too, not because she was waiting for someone else to knock, but because she no longer needed to close it to feel safe. And as the figures grew smaller against the horizon, Clara Whitfield turned back toward her home, not to protect it, not to hold on to it, but to live inside it in a way she never had before, knowing that what she had done had not brought something new into her life. It had revealed what had always been there, waiting for her to see it. The dust settled slowly after they left, not all at once, but in thin drifting lines that caught the afternoon light and stretched across the road, like something reluctant to disappear. Clara stood there a moment longer, even after Ethan and Noah were no more than shapes against the horizon, then less than that, then gone completely, and still she did not move. Not because she expected them to return, but because something in her had not yet caught up to the quiet that followed behind her. The town had begun to breathe again. Doors opened, voices returned, low at first, then steadier, as if people were testing the air to see if it would hold them. A few figures crossed the road slower than usual, their eyes lifting toward Clara, not in the old way, not dismissive, not indifferent, but careful, as if they were measuring something they had never needed to measure before. Respect had no sound when it arrived. It did not announce itself. It simply changed the way people stood, the way they looked, the way they chose their words. Clara turned at last, stepping back inside her home, the same worn boards beneath her feet, the same walls that had once felt smaller than they were, but now everything seemed to carry a different weight, not heavier, just clearer. She moved to the table, where the paper still lay unfolded beside the silver token and the basket left by the fence. She placed her hand lightly against the document, not to check if it was real, but to feel what it meant. Ownership, not as power, not as protection, but as something steady, something that could not be taken simply because someone believed it could. Outside, a knock came, soft, deliberate, not urgent. Clara paused, then walked to the door, opening it without hesitation. This time a man stood there, older than the others, his coat worn, his hands marked by years of work. He held his hat low in both hands, not out of fear, but out of respect. Miss Whitfield, he said, his voice even. I have a small plot near the creek, been there longer than most. I heard what happened this morning. Clara nodded once, not inviting him and not turning him away, just listening. He shifted slightly, then continued, I signed papers years ago, things I did not fully understand, thought it was the only way to keep what little I had. His eyes lifted to meet hers, not asking for forgiveness, not expecting anything, just stating truth. If what that man said is real, then I may have been giving away more than I knew. Clara studied him for a moment, seeing not a stranger, not a burden, just another person. Standing at the same edge she had stood on not long ago. You should have it looked at, she said, simply the words calm, but certain. He let out a breath, not relief, not yet, but something close. I thought so too, he answered, then hesitated one more time, before adding, I would not have said it yesterday. Clara gave a small nod. I know. He replaced his hat slowly, then stepped back, turning toward the road, without waiting for more. And as he left, Clara realized something. The change had already begun, not because Ethan had spoken, not because the riders had come, but because people had seen what fairness looked like when it stood without shouting inside the house. She moved again, this time with purpose. She cleared the table, not rushing, not cleaning, but making space. The paper remained, the token remained, but everything else she set aside, as if preparing for something new, not an event, not a visitor, but a way of living. She had not known she was allowed to claim. The light shifted through the window longer, now stretching across the floor in quiet lines that moved with time rather than against it. Clara stepped outside once more, looking across the land, not to guard it, not to measure it, but to understand it. The fence still leaned in places, the roof still needed repair, the ground still carried the marks of seasons that had not been kind, but none of that felt like loss anymore. It felt like work, the kind she could choose rather than endure, and in that difference, there was something steady, something that did not depend on who might come down the road tomorrow or what they might carry with them. The town behind her moved on, not as it had before, but not entirely changed either, because places like this did not transform in a single morning. They shifted slowly through choices, through small moments, through doors opened or closed. Clara Whitfield stood there in the quiet of her land, the wind moving soft through the open space, the silver token resting now in her pocket, the paper safe inside, and for the first time in a long while she was not waiting for something to happen. She was already standing inside it. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different. They arrived the same way they always had, with pale morning light stretching across the land and the sound of wind brushing against wood and fence and open ground. But something beneath those familiar rhythms had changed, not loudly, not completely, but enough that Clara felt it in the way she woke, without the weight she had carried for years pressing down on her chest. She stepped outside early, as she always had, the air sharp but clean, the sky wide and clear in a way that made the land feel larger than it had the week before. She walked the boundary of her property slowly, not to measure it, not to guard it, but to understand it, each step deliberate, each glance taking in what had always been there, but never truly hers. The fence needed repair in 3 places she counted, without writing it down. The well would need to be checked before the next cold set in, and the roof still held a weakness near the back corner where the boards had begun to split, but none of it felt overwhelming. It felt like something she could shape with her own hands later. That morning the town began to move in its usual pattern, but the usual had shifted. People greeted each other with shorter pauses, longer looks, as if they were aware of something just beneath the surface, a quiet recalibration of how things worked. Clara walked into town for the first time since that morning, not because she had to, but because she chose to. The general store stood where it always had, the same wooden sign, the same uneven steps, but when she stepped inside, the conversation that had been flowing moments before softened, not stopped, just softened enough to notice. Mr. Hargrove behind the counter looked up, his hands still resting on a crate of supplies. Miss Whitfield, he said, his tone steady, but carrying a note that had not been there before. Not apology, not surprise, something closer to respect. Clara gave a small nod, returning the greeting. She moved through the store, selecting what she needed: flour, a small sack of grain, a few nails for the fence, nothing more, nothing excessive. When she reached the counter, she placed the items down, and for a moment, there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just new. Mr. Hargrove glanced at the total, then back at her, and something in his expression shifted again, this time towards certainty. This will be settled from your account, he said quietly. Clara did not speak right away because the words carried more than they seemed to on the surface. Her account, something that had never existed before, something that suggested a place, a standing she had not been given until now. She nodded once. That will do. Mr. Hargrove completed the transaction without further comment, but as she gathered her things, he added, almost as an afterthought, if you need anything else, you let me know. Clara met his gaze, then holding it just long enough to acknowledge what had been said, not as a favor, not as charity, but as something earned. I will, she replied, and stepped back out into the light outside. A few people passed her on the road, some offering small nods, others brief words, none lingering, none pressing, but none turning away either. And that was the difference, not what they said, not how loudly they said it, but the fact that they did not look through her. Anymore they saw her, and in that simple shift something lasting had taken root. By afternoon Clara was back at her land, working along the fence, her hands steady as she replaced a broken post, driving it into the ground with measured effort. The work was not easy, but it was honest, each movement building something rather than holding it together against loss. As she straightened, she noticed a figure approaching from the direction of the creek, the same older man from the day before. His pace slow but purposeful, he stopped a few feet away, removing his hat again, though this time the gesture felt different, not hesitant, not uncertain, but respectful in a way that carried no weight of apology. "I took your advice," he said, holding out a folded paper. Clara stepped closer, taking it from him, her eyes scanning the lines, not fully understanding every word, but seeing enough to grasp the meaning. The land he had believed he was protecting had never been his in the way he thought it had been, and yet now, with that truth laid bare, there was a path to correct it. "I did not know," he said simply, and there was no shame in it, only clarity. Clara folded the paper carefully, handing it back. "You do now," she said, and the man nodded once, a small movement, but firm enough to hold. "I do." He placed his hat back on his head, then added, "If you ever need help with that fence, I am not far." Clara looked at him for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "I will remember that." He left without another word, and Clara returned to her work, the sun lowering slowly, casting long shadows across the land, each line of light and dark stretching further as the day moved toward evening. And in that quiet, she understood something that had not been clear before. What had changed was not just her place in the town or the ownership written on paper. It was the way people now chose to stand in relation to one another, not above, not below, but beside. And that kind of change did not come from force, it came from seeing something true and deciding not to look away from it. Clara Whitfield rested her hands briefly against the newly set post, feeling its steadiness in the ground, and for the first time the work ahead of her did not feel like survival. It felt like building something that would last. The first frost came quiet that season, not sudden, not harsh, just a thin silver layer stretching across the edges of Clara Whitfield's land, as if the earth itself had decided to rest for a moment before the long cold ahead. She stood at the fence line early that morning, her breath visible in the air, her hands wrapped around a worn pair of gloves that had seen more years than they should have needed to, and yet everything in front of her felt different now, not easier, not softer, just hers. The repairs she had started weeks before had taken shape. The fence stood straighter, the well held steady, the roof no longer whispered in the wind when night settled in, and though the land still demanded work, it no longer felt like something slipping away. It felt like something growing into itself. Behind her the house stood, as it always had, weathered, with simple lines, no grand presence, but there was a quiet strength to it now, something that had not been visible before, because it had not been seen. The door remained open, as it often did these days, not out of habit, not out of defiance, but because it no longer needed to be closed to feel secure. Clara turned back toward it, slowly stepping across the ground with a pace that carried no urgency, no hesitation, just purpose. Inside the small room, the table held fewer things than before, no papers spread out, no tokens placed in careful view. The document had been stored safely where it belonged. The silver piece rested in a drawer, not hidden, not displayed, simply kept, like something that had done its work and did not need to speak again. A small fire burned steady in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the boards, and Clara paused beside it for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. Not heavy, not empty, just complete. A knock came, then soft, familiar, not the uncertain kind that had marked earlier days. Clara moved to the door, without thinking, opening it to find the older man from the creek standing there along with another beside him, younger, but carrying the same careful posture. "We brought what we could," he said, gesturing to a bundle of wood and tools. Between them, Clara stepped aside, allowing them in, not as guests, not as strangers, but as neighbors, the kind that stood beside rather than apart. They set the tools down near the wall, speaking little as they did, because words were not needed for what they had come to do. The work began, without announcement, the older man moving toward the back, where the boards needed reinforcing, the younger one checking the hinges on the door. Clara joined them, naturally, not directing, not overseeing, just working alongside them. The sound of hammer-on wood filled the space, steady, even, and for the first time in a long while the house did not feel like something she had to defend. It felt like something shared outside the town. Moved through its day, the same roads, the same buildings, but the way people carried themselves had changed, not in grand gestures, not in loud declarations, But in small choices, a door held open, a nod returned, a question asked where silence once stood, and though not everyone moved the same, not everyone shifted at once, the direction had changed, and it held, as the work inside slowed, and finally stopped. The older man stepped back, wiping his hands against his coat that should hold through the winter, he said, and Clara nodded, not with relief, not with surprise, but with quiet certainty. I know it will. He gave a small smile. Then turning toward the door with the younger man beside him, we will be by again before the next storm, he added. Clara did not thank them, not because she was ungrateful, but because the moment did not ask for it. What they had done was not charity, it was part of something that now belonged to all of them. They stepped out into the cold air, leaving the door open behind them. As they went, and Clara stood there for a moment watching them walk back toward the road, their figures steady against the pale light of the day, she closed the door then, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. The sound of it settling into place, soft, final. She moved back into the room, the fire still steady, the space quiet and sure, and as she sat for the first time that day, allowing herself to rest, she understood something that did not need to be spoken, not to anyone, not even to herself. Out here, justice did not arrive with noise. It did not need to be declared. It came in the way a man lowered his eyes, when he understood, in the way a town learned to stand differently, in the way a door once opened without reason became the reason. Everything changed, and Clara Whitfield sat in the quiet of her home, not waiting, not wondering, just living inside a truth that had always been there, strong enough to hold its ground long before anyone else decided to see it.